this section, we will really be diving deep into evolution, one of my favorite topics in biology. So a whole new era of biology began in 1859 when Charles Darwin published The Origin of the Species. Now, keep in mind that this is like in the mid-1800s. Darwin took this epic journey, leaving from Britain, heading down all the way to South America, Rio de Janeiro, wrapping around the Cape Horn, heading on the other side here, west side, Chile, and so on, all the way to the Galapagos Islands. So imagine this, you're from Britain, and you go to South America in the 1800s. This is before the internet, of course, and imagine the types of animals and plants that he saw in South America that are not in Britain. It must have been mind-blowing for him. Anyway, it was, I forget how long the journey was, 3 or 5 years on a boat. Basically went all the way across the world. After the Galapagos, they kept going. They ended up over in Australia, and then all the way back past Africa, over to South America again, and then finally back to Britain. So imagine how epic that journey is. Crazy. Now, the Galapagos Islands, those are west of South America, and you see there's this tiny little group of islands basically in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Now, this is very important. Geographic isolation promotes speciation. All right, let's get back to here. How did Darwin define evolution? Evolution may be defined by Darwin's phrase, descent with modification. Darwin proposed that Earth's many species are descendants of ancestral species that were different from the present-day species. Okay, that makes sense. Basically, what he's arguing for here is that there was a common ancestor. If you go back far enough in time, you could find common ancestors for species. The Darwinian Revolution challenged traditional views of a young Earth inhabited by unchanging species. Again, you have to look at what was the predominant ideas back in the mid-1800s. Well, if you're not aware of this, the church was very, very dominant. So most people were very religious, and there was a lot of resistance to the idea that the world had been around for millions of years and that evolution was just this natural process. The Bible, many of the Bibles would tell you, across even different religions, that there was a creation. You know, the creationist God or many gods created everything, and for whatever reason, evolution seemed to be incompatible with this. I have the idea that, hey, why can't you have creation and evolution? Why couldn't there be a creator and then evolution just runs wild over millions and millions of years? So I don't see why you can't have both. But while we're on that topic, should give you a disclaimer that some religions do not believe in evolution. And if you're one of those people, that's okay with me. But I do want you to have your mind open to the fact that this is a possibility. For myself, I believe that it is total fact that evolution has happened because I see examples of it every single day. Fossils, as you know, are remains or traces of organisms from the past, usually found in sedimentary rock, which appears in layers or strata. Now, what is strata? Strata just simply means different layers of Earth. So I'll give you a picture here of strata. And you can see that, generally speaking, the deeper that you dig, the further back in time you will be going. So you see if you dig down just a little bit, then you're at 10,000 years ago. You keep digging down, now you're getting to 500,000 years ago, and so on, until you're in the millions of years ago. And what we notice is that the further back in time you go, the fossils tend to not really resemble the fossils of today. So that makes sense. And that just shows that change is happening over long, long periods of time. Now, for those who don't know, the Earth has been around for about 4.5 billion years. Now, how long have humans been around for, roughly? Only about 500,000 years. Okay, our ancestors go back around 2 million years ago or so. That's when we started walking upright. But when you think about it, human-like creatures have only been around for, say, 5 million years or so, which is absolutely nothing if you consider that the Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years. 5 million years is just a tiny snippet. In fact, just so you know, how long were dinosaurs around for? Dinosaurs were around for about 150 million years. So dinosaurs were around this long, humans have been around for this long. It's really quite mind-blowing. He concluded that extinction from a catastrophic event must have occurred to end the current species, and that a new species arrived from migration. Now, this is a pretty wild idea from the fact that some of you may not know there has been many great extinction events on Earth. Probably the most famous being 65 million years ago, when that giant asteroid came and smashed into Earth near Mexico, the Gulf of Mexico, and it's estimated that something like 95% of all species were wiped out after that asteroid hit. But something else that's kind of mind-blowing is that without that asteroidal impact, then humans may not even exist right now. And that is because around the time of the dinosaurs, 65 million years ago, there were mammals, but they were really tiny. They were like mice-like creatures, and then you had the giant dinosaurs. So all the dinosaurs get wiped out, except for the birds. The birds nowadays are actually relatives of dinosaurs. And you can tell that by looking at their feet. Next time you see a bird, look at their feet. Dinosaur feet. I mean it. It's the truth. The dinosaurs get wiped off the face of the Earth. That provides an opportunity for these small little mammals to take over and start kicking ass. So mammals became the dominant species over the next 60 million years, leading to humans. So I have a YouTube video over here. If you go to Hybrid Dr. J and check out this video I did that talks about that, basically saying that if the asteroid came 5 minutes later or 5 minutes earlier, then humans may not exist and dinosaurs would still be ruling the Earth today. Pretty wild stuff. I told you already Darwin had a consuming interest in nature. He was very inquisitive. He first studied medicine, unsuccessfully, then theology, so that's interesting. He studied religion. Now the Galapagos had all these really cool creatures that don't exist anywhere else on Earth. For example, the marine iguana. Most of you know what an iguana is. It's that dinosaur-looking lizard. But in the Galapagos, they can actually swim in the ocean and hunt for food underwater. It's the only place on Earth that you see this. To the Galapagos finches, the famous finches. So, what's the deal with the finches? Well, when Darwin got to the Galapagos, he noticed that there was a bunch of different islands that you can see here, and the terrain varies from one island to another. There's different resources and so on. And because of that, what he noticed is that there were these birds that were on each island, but depending on which island he was on, the birds looked a little different, but very, very similar. For instance, if you look at the body type of this cactus eater, you see that the body type of a seed eater is basically exactly the same. But notice the difference in their beaks. So let's say there's an island that has lots of cactus. Then this bird does really well because it has this sharper beak where it can poke in and it can eat or get water from the cactus without getting poked. But then you see on another island, maybe there's these hard seeds. And this bird does better because it has a really robust beak. And that robust beak can break down those hard seeds. Then you go to another island, you have the same size and shape bird, but this time it's got a little tiny beak, and that's good for insect eating. So this really was kind of like an aha moment for Darwin. What he concluded was that there must have been only one type of bird species that originally inhabited the Galapagos. This could have happened, say there was a bird species, a flock of birds that were flying in the Pacific, and there was a massive storm which blew them out from Chile or Ecuador over to the Galapagos and basically stranded them there because it's too far for them to fly back. And they end up, that's their new habitat. But over thousands and thousands and actually millions of years, you start to get these adaptations occurring. Now, here's the tough part. How do these adaptations occur? Is it that the birds purposely changed their beak? Of course not. It's actually a random mutation in their DNA which allows for a different beak shape. So picture this. Let's say you've got this entire flock of birds. They all have the same types of beaks. Then one of the birds that has a nest on the cactus-infested island, one of these birds lays an egg. It just so happens that that DNA in this little egg has been mutated slightly, which means that this bird's beak is going to be more pointy than its parent's beak and all the other birds before it. So it gets born, it's got this pointy beak. It actually has more success in finding food than the rest of the population. Now, what does that mean? It was a random mutation that provided an advantage, a survival advantage. So, what do you think could happen here? Do you think that this bird that randomly had its beak changed, do you think that it might have a greater chance of survival and therefore a greater chance of reproduction? Yes, it's going to have greater reproductive success. It's probably going to live longer. It's going to have more offspring. So get this, it passes on its mutated DNA to the next generation, and now you've got a bunch of birds that have that pointy beak, and they start out-competing the other birds with the regular shaped beak. So you can see that over generations and generations and generations, this new advantage can live on and outcompete the other birds. And now you can see how that could happen all over the world in different environments. So really, the environment, we call that natural selection, because the environment is choosing what trait is advantageous in that specific area. That's evolution. Oh, thank you. Yes, it's hard to explain this. It's a very complex topic, but once you get it, it will blow your mind and open up your mind to many possibilities. Darwin's observations lead him to write, The Origin of the Species. So in 1844, he wrote an essay on the origin of the species, natural selection, but did not introduce his theory publicly because he anticipated an uproar. Who's going to uproar at this? The church. So remember, he studied theology. His wife was very religious. And it's interesting because he was sort of a tortured soul. He figured out all of this cool stuff, but he was scared to share it with the general public for fear of being burnt at the stake. You know, he was afraid there'd be, riots or protests, or people would say, "This is blasphemy. We don't believe in evolution." He was afraid to publish his findings. But look at this. 14 years later, he receives a manuscript from his buddy Alfred Wallace. And Wallace had developed a theory of natural selection similar to Darwin's. So Darwin quickly finished the Origin of the Species and published it the next year. There were definitely other people, other scientists around the world that were also coming to the same conclusions. Now, Darwin, because he had put so much work into this, and realizing that someone else might break this news, he rushed to get his book published because he's like, uh-oh, other people are onto this. I better just publish this, and then we'll just see what happens. So that's what he did. He published it. Darwin became more of a rock star after he died than when he was alive. So he was still kind of that tortured soul. He developed two main ideas. Descent with modification explains life's unity and diversity. Natural selection, the environment selects for certain characteristics within a population. Now, there's this great show called Cosmos. Neil deGrasse Tyson has done them. And one of the episodes, in the first season, I think it's like somewhere around episode 3 maybe. Go and find it, and they talk about dogs and how dogs have had selective breeding over time. So it's really fascinating to find out. Did you know that if you went back far enough in time, like let's say you went back, I think it's around 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, there was no such thing as dogs. Isn't that crazy? But there were wolves, the gray wolf. And all dogs alive today are descendants from the gray wolf. Now picture this. How could that have happened? Let's say there's a family sitting around a fire, say 5,000 years ago, and they're cooking some meat, and a gray wolf smells the meat cooking. But get this gray wolf had a mutation in its DNA, which allowed it to be a little tamer. So it wasn't as wild and aggressive as usual. So it's not really afraid of humans. It walks up and, the family sitting around the fire, they sort of look over and they see this wolf and they're like, what's going on? Is it going to attack us? But it just kind of looks at them. It's not showing its teeth or anything. It's not growling, but it smells the food. So the family takes a piece of meat and they throw it over to the dog. Sorry, it's not a dog yet, it's a wolf. They throw it over to the wolf, and the wolf eats it, and it sort of has this moment like, hey, if I hang out with these humans, I can get free food. So you can imagine that this could have happened time and time again, and this gray wolf sort of becomes their pet, right? And then let's say this gray wolf then reproduces with another wolf. Well, some of those pups are going to have the aggressive, normal genes, and some of the pups are going to have that more calm gene. So what they could do over time is, if there was a really aggressive wolf pup, they could just murder it and keep the calm ones. I know it sounds barbaric, but you can imagine this happened many, many, many times over generations. And eventually, you end up with this sort of calm wolf type pet. And then you can imagine over tons of time that other mutations and things start to happen. So let's say now you've got this calm wolf that people are starting to use for hunting, and they sort of live with them and all that. Then let's say there's a mutation where you get this miniature wolf all of a sudden because it's like a dwarfism type wolf. Well, some people may have liked that. They thought, oh, this is better for climbing into rabbit holes and getting rabbits. So then they start selectively breeding to try and create more of these small little wolves. So you can see how you can start to get these different types of dogs from a gray wolf originally. Now, this is not natural selection. This is artificial selection, also known as selective breeding. So over time, that's how we end up with a Chihuahua or a Great Dane. Isn't that fascinating? I love that stuff. So anyway, check it out on Cosmos is the show, and it talks about dog evolution. He noted that humans have modified other species by selecting and breeding individuals with desired traits, a process called artificial selection. Boom, that's what we just talked about. Natural selection, a summary. Individuals with certain heritable characteristics survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. So it's given them a survival advantage. Natural selection increases the adaptation of organisms to their environment over time. If an environment changes over time, natural selection may result in adaptation to those new conditions and may give rise to new species. What does new species mean? It means that if you have two different species, they are incompatible sexually, meaning they can't have fertile offspring. Okay, that's when we know it's a different species. That means that there's been genetic drift between them enough that they can't have a fertile offspring. Okay, apparently you can take a lion and a tiger and mate them together and they can have offspring. It's called a liger, but the liger cannot have its own offspring. So you can see that the DNA difference between a lion and a tiger is just enough that they can have fertile offspring. So that's when we have speciation. Note that individuals do not evolve its populations over time. So yes, it could start with one individual, but evolution is really in a population, because if that individual doesn't pass on its genes to the future generation, then evolution is not going to happen. So it doesn't matter if you have an organism that has some amazing new talent. If it doesn't pass that trait on to future generations, then evolution is just a dead end right there. The environment selects what traits are advantageous. Really interesting. That's why we call it natural selection, because nature is choosing. We are not choosing. Evolution is supported by overwhelming amount of scientific evidence. This is again why I say I don't call it a theory. I don't call evolution a theory. I call it a fact. There's so much evidence to support it. Why can't we just say it's fact? Because I think the only way we could say it's fact is if we could invent a time machine, go back in time, and then do some crazy time-lapse video to show over millions of years what's changing and how things are adapting. So you can see how that would be problematic, because we can't make a time machine. As far as we know, if we could make a time machine, there's already time travelers here, and apparently There aren't, so I don't think we can do it. The key points on natural selection. Natural selection does not create new traits, but edits or selects for traits already present in the population. The local environment determines which traits will be selected for or selected against in any specific population. Hey, check this out. Have you ever seen the diagram of different embryos at their place of development? Watch this. Embryo development. So if we look at fish, salamander, tortoise, chicken, pig, cow, rabbit, human, look at the first trimester. Compare them. Fish, salamander, tortoise, chicken, pig, cow. Do they not look almost identical? Isn't this bizarre that the human embryo looks almost the same as a salamander embryo? This is evidence that we used to be the same thing a really, 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 really long time ago. Isn't that crazy? So this is why I like to say that we're all related. So even if you look outside at a tree, you're related to that tree. I know that sounds ridiculous, but if you go back far enough in time, we were actually the same thing. Isn't that bizarre? I love that stuff.